Okay, welcome back everyone for our Kriya Yoga online solstice celebration retreat. We're in Saturday, and our final official lecture with Isha Das, Craig Bullock from the Assisi Institute. I've known Craig for quite a long time. He's a student of Mr. Davis in Kriya Yoga tradition, also been ordained by Mr. Davis. And as I mentioned, he's the director of the Assisi Institute in Rochester, New York, where we will be gathering September around the equinox for an in-person retreat there. So Isha Das is going to be speaking with us today about, well, we'll find out, but the idea is for him to speak about living with grace. So thank you for being here, Isha Das. I appreciate you taking the time to be here with us.
Oh, it's really my pleasure. And I want to just thank you, Ryan, for organizing this. I think, we're living in interesting times, and I think it's helpful for all of us to come together like this and just to be virtually in each other's presence and to experience the collective consciousness of such wonderful people. So thank you for putting this together.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. And you have as much time as you need, but also, as I've told participants previously, if questions come up during the session, they're welcome to type those questions into the chat box. And then at the end, once you're finished, I'll field some of those questions for you, so we can have a little question and answer, if that's all right.
That's fine. When we talked about doing this, you told me I had as much time as I would like. And my Italian mother had a nickname for me. It's Boca Grande, which translates big mouth.
Well, we'll see how it goes then. You definitely have to be done within 4 hours, because then we've got the 6 o'clock meditation. So.
I think I can squeeze it in.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll pin you up here and I'll turn it over. So let's welcome Isha Das and his presentation on living with grace.
Thank you. Again, namaste. It's wonderful to be with you this afternoon. At least here in the Northeast, it's afternoon. And again, I want to thank Ryan for organizing this. And I can't state how important I think these gatherings are. This morning at the Assisi Institute, we have a core group of disciples, and we meet once a month. And part of what we talked about this morning, and I'm going to connect it to what we're doing now and what Ryan is doing, is even though we started to physically gather again in our temple, it doesn't feel like we're picking up where we left off prior to COVID. It seems like we're moving in a different direction, and we can't quite define it yet or describe it with accuracy, but we're not just picking up where we left off. And there's something about a gathering like this of like-minded souls. I think it's going to become more and more crucial, more and more important to gather together virtually and to meditate and to pray and to meditate on the words of the great masters. Somehow, when we do that, not only does it support us, but I think we bring a measure of light into the world. So again, it's so good to be meeting with you. And I want to honor Ryan for putting all of this together. And we're looking forward to having Ryan come to the Assisi Institute in September. My topic, what Ryan asked me to talk about today, is grace. And grace is one of those words where you tend to know it when you see it. You can recognize it, but it's very, very hard to really define it. It's very, very hard to really capture it. In fact, I think it's always going to be a little bit beyond our words and our concepts, but we can intuitively, again, learn to recognize it and cooperate with it. Probably the simplest and best definition of grace that I've come across is from Roy Eugene Davis. He says, grace is God's manifesting energy and consciousness in the world, in the universe. Grace is God's manifesting energy and consciousness. And I think that's a good place to start. I also have a quote from Swami Kriyananda, a direct disciple of Yogananda, where he says, the secret of meditation and the spiritual life is receptivity to grace, and in the full awareness that God's power alone can liberate the soul. So again, grace is something that is absolutely essential to the spiritual life. So let me begin here. You know, I make my living professionally as a psychologist, and one of the things I learned studying psychology is that the human brain operates in such a way so that it looks out for what is dangerous. It's always focusing on what is not right and what is wrong so that it can compensate and so that it can survive. And that's not a bad mechanism. However, what that does sometimes is it blinds us to all the manifestations of grace. So let me kind of talk about those manifestations for a moment. For example, the fact that I woke up this morning and you woke up this morning, that's a grace. There are millions of people who went to bed last night and did not wake up this morning. I told my wife, Vicky, this morning that I'm glad that God gave me another day to love you, to love my wife. So the fact that we're alive and here right now is grace. The fact that we have air to breathe is grace. The sun that is shining, at least here in Rochester, New York, is feeding the plants, and through photosynthesis will create food that we can eat. It will create flowers that give us beauty. That's grace. We live and move and have our being in a sea of absolute grace. And what I'm going to get to later is our very nature at the deepest level is grace. But again, we live and we move and we have our being in this shoreless ocean of grace. And if you go to the root word for grace in the Latin, part of what it means is simple, it's gift. Life is a gift. Our existence is a gift. We are a gift to ourselves, to each other, and to the world. So we have to understand in this context that grace is something large, it is good, it is beautiful, it is filled with mystery, and we literally live on grace. So my first point is once we begin to realize that we exist in this sea of graciousness, it produces, or at least it should produce, a sense of gratitude. More and more my mantra after I do my Kriya, and I sit in the presence and in the silence, more and more my mantra is just thank you. Thank you for when I turned on the lights today, there was light. Thank you that I have enough food to eat. Thank you that I'm healthy. Thank you that I'm alive. See, again, once we begin to appreciate grace and the fact that everything about our life is a gift, we are gift, then what begins to happen is that there is this gratitude that begins to open within our hearts. And as that gratitude opens, we become more aware of grace, number one, and the more grace can flow through us. There's an unlimited and unbounded level of grace that we can tap into. So that's the first thing I want to say about grace. Grace is gift, and we all live and move and have our being in this gift of grace. The second thing I want to say, and it ties into what Roy said, that grace is God's manifesting consciousness and energy. So I want to talk about grace as an energy. Grace is an energy that literally serves the evolution of humankind. Evolution has unfolded not as coincidence, not as happenstance, but it has been guided and moved along by the energy of grace. Let me give you a concrete example. Whenever I would go to Roy's place in Georgia, as soon as I walked on the grounds, there was a palpable sense of grace. There was this palpable sense of peace and fullness and right order. Whenever Roy would talk, there was grace that emanated from him. There was a force, there was an energy that had the effect of elevating my consciousness, and I think the consciousness of everyone around us. And again, because Roy worked there, he lived there, so many people came and prayed and meditated there, the whole grounds there have become this portal into grace. So grace is literally an energy that guides our collective evolution, the collective evolution of the human race, but it's also an energy that guides us individually. It is a palpable force. And the more we attune ourselves to it, the more we become aware of it and the more we know how to flow with it. Now, what I want to do is make a differentiation between grace and electricity. And I'll explain what I mean in a moment, but it's very important if we're going to consciously avail ourselves to grace and work with grace, then we have to know what is grace and what I'm calling electricity. And we have to be able to discern grace from electricity. So let me try to describe electricity. Electricity, it's like this crackling energy. Rather than opening the heart or the third eye, it really tends to trigger our adrenaline. It creates friction. Much of what we see in the political climate here in the United States, it's not grace, it's electricity. What you see at a football game is electricity. Now, that's not necessarily bad, but I want you to see that there's this thing called electricity, and it's very prevalent in our culture. It doesn't heal, it doesn't bring together, it creates tension, it divides, it creates friction. Certainly, cable news is filled with electricity. Grace, on the other hand, again, it's that energy. It is that intelligent force that elevates us. And it brings us together. It opens the heart. It makes us more compassionate. It makes us more loving. It makes us more peaceful. And it also opens the third eye and our capacity for vision, for sight, true seeing, and true wisdom. Grace elevates and it transforms. Electricity divides. And it causes a level of degeneration. So I just think at this time in our history, to be able really to discern the difference between grace and electricity is very, very important. Again, grace is that energy that elevates and transforms. Now, I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball. We tend to reduce the experience of grace to something that is pleasant, even blissful. And yes, grace is often experienced as something pleasant and blissful. But there's what I call dark grace. And by dark grace, I don't mean something evil or ominous. Grace is that divine energy, that divine consciousness that will do whatever it takes to transform a situation, a country, a person, a people, a family. I'll repeat that. Grace is that energy of the divine, the consciousness of the divine that will do whatever it takes to evolve. And if pleasantness and peacefulness will bring about our evolution, then that's what will happen. That's the grace that is given. But if sometimes pain or loss is what will evolve us, then grace will show up in that way. I'll give you an example from my own life. I was 12 when my mother died, and my father was an alcoholic, and I was the youngest child, the only one at home. And to make a long story short, within 3 years, I was essentially homeless. I dropped out of high school, etc. Now let me go ahead. I've had two spiritual mentors in the body. One would be Roy Eugene Davis. The other one is a Franciscan priest some of you may know of, Richard Rohr. He has a center out in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And Richard was in town. I'm going back to the mid-'80s here. He was in Rochester speaking, and we were driving in my car. And he turned to me and he said, it's a good thing that you had the childhood that you had. And I kind of got frustrated with him. I said, Richard, and I went through my whole litany of grievances about my childhood, and I was in psychotherapy at the time, and I threw all that jargon out. Richard, I'm trying to give myself the childhood I never had. I'm trying to parent the inner child, etc. And you're telling me that it was good that I had the childhood that I had. And he was always and still is very compassionate with me. And he said, no, I know you had a difficult childhood. He said, but you're a very gifted person. And if you weren't wounded, you'd probably just be a yuppie making lots of money and contributing nothing to the human race, to the world. He said, because you're wounded, you've become a wounded healer. Maybe that was the childhood that you were meant to have. And again, this light bulb went off inside of me that maybe in some mysterious way, not that I would wish it on anybody, that my childhood was an expression of grace. Those things that happened to me were an expression of grace because they moved me in the direction of a spiritual path, and ultimately they moved me in the direction of Kriya Yoga. So what I'm just trying to say is that we can't limit what grace looks like. We can't limit it at all. Grace will show up in whatever way it needs to show up to evolve and move a situation along. Let me give you one other example. I have a stepson. He is 38 going on 39. Wonderful young man. He's a aspiring playwright and director in New York City. And he's also quadriplegic. When he was 14, he decided to go out and jump off our deck in the snow to make snow angels for his sisters, 2 younger sisters. And he severed his spinal cord. And he was unconscious. We thought he was going to die. And when they took the oxygen tube out of his mouth and he was conscious, he said 3 things. First thing he said is what any 14-year-old would say. He said, I'm hungry, I want some pizza. Second thing he said is, we're not going to focus on what I can't do. We're going to focus on what I can do. And the third thing he said, there must be something that God wants me to do as a paralyzed person that I couldn't otherwise do. Now, he may not use the same words that I'm using, but at some level, even this accident, that again, I wouldn't wish on anybody, he wouldn't wish on anybody, he saw it as an expression of grace, that somehow God was using it to affect his life, to evolve him, and to evolve the people around him. And he's a wonderful, wonderful young man doing good things with his life. I say to him occasionally that he is naturally, almost effortlessly, an enlightened person. But again, grace will show up in whatever way it needs to show up in order to evolve a situation. Next thing I want to say about grace, and this could be a little bit controversial, but I think if you understand me, it will make sense. At a subtle level, it's very subtle. Essentially, there are 2 forces that guide our lives. There's karma. And again, I can't give a complete talk on karma, that's not the purpose. But to keep it simple, karma is this mechanical force that guides our life, that impacts us. As Yogananda said, most people, if they haven't gotten to that level of self-realization, they're puppets to their karma. And then there's grace. To the extent that we open ourselves to grace, we begin to trump karma. I'm going to repeat that. To the extent that we open ourselves to the consciousness and energy of the divine, we begin to trump karma. There's a teaching that Yogananda taught, and I'll just paraphrase it very generally, that when people are initiated, if they are initiated in the Kriya Yoga sincerely, that a certain amount of their karma is removed. It's not magic. What it is, well, it's the magic of grace, but it's not magic the way we typically think of magic. What I think Yogananda was pointing to is that as we meditate, as we practice the yamas and the niyamas, we begin to live not by the compulsion of grace or the compulsion of karma. We begin to live from the freshness of grace. Grace creates new pathways. Grace creates new opportunities. Grace begins to allow us to see what is karma and what are new possibilities in front of us. So it's just very important to realize that to the extent that we avail ourselves to grace, we begin to transcend karma, that automatic, those mechanical impressions that we carry from lifetime to lifetime. We begin to be liberated from them. Two other points about grace, and then I'll take some time for questions. If I were to give a formal title to this talk, it would be Grace and Grit. So what do I mean? There are mornings, for example, when I wake up that I'm not feeling particularly inspired to meditate. Maybe I'm tired, maybe I'm feeling off, maybe my nervous system is wrinkled and agitated. But I make that choice to sit and meditate. That's the grit. I make that choice to sit and meditate. And in making that choice, that grittiness, a channel of grace really begins to flow through me and through us. So in the spiritual life, we can't fall into this sort of passivity that it's all grace and we don't have to do anything. We have to have this grit. We have to make choices. There are times, for example, when I'm in a situation, a social situation, and I don't quite know what to do, or I'm feeling some irritation bubbling up inside of me. I have a lot of pitta, so I'm told, and I feel that irritation. I don't just surrender to it. I take a deep breath. And often internally, I will just ask the question, what is the wisest and most loving action or response in this situation? And there's something about the grittiness of pausing, watching, breathing, and then asking that question that allows the intelligence that runs the universe, of which grace is a manifestation, to manifest through me. And I intuitively know what to do and, again, how to handle myself. So grace is very powerful, and it has, again, the capacity to trump our karma. But we also have to nurture this grittiness, this grit, where we'll pray when we don't feel like praying. We'll meditate when we don't want to meditate. We'll make the healthy choices that we know we need to make for our lives, even when we don't feel like it. And in that grittiness, then grace can flow. And, at some point in all of our lives, some kind of difficulty, some kind of tragedy is going to come our way. It doesn't mean that we've been abandoned. It doesn't mean that grace isn't working. But we have to have that grittiness where we're going to stay present. We're going to feel all the discomfort. We're going to feel all the pain that we need to feel. But we're also going to stay present to the light that is within us. We're going to stay present to grace. And that allows us to navigate through life's difficult and painful challenges with dignity and grace. Let me go back to something that Richard Rohr, this Franciscan priest and mentor of mine, This was before we had the internet and email. We used to send each other cards and letters. And at the bottom of one of his letters, he wrote two things. He always told me to trust. He said, trust yourself. But the second thing he said was, carry your wounds gracefully. He wasn't saying repress your feelings. He wasn't saying deny your feelings, but carry your wounds gracefully. Feel the pain, but carry them with grace. Carry them with God. Carry them not just in your mind and in your emotions, but carry them in your soul, in your divine essence. Lean into grace in times of difficulty, and the grace will sustain us. But again, we have to have that grittiness. We have to be willing to stand, to meditate, to pray. Yogananda said, and Roy loved to quote this, read a little, meditate more, think of God always. That's an expression of grittiness. And last piece that I want to say about grace, something I touched on earlier. Our true nature is grace. Whether you call it the self with a capital S, or the soul, or the image of the divine, or the spark of the divine, if we peel away all the layers of who and what we think we are, there is just this pure divinity. There is luminosity. There is radiance. We are luminosity. We are radiance. We are wisdom. We are strength. We are grace. That's why in the spiritual life, we don't reject the superficial self or the personality. We don't demonize it. We witness it with compassion and love, and we witness all the machinations that go into the personality, the egoic self, with compassion. But we go deeper and deeper on the inside and realize that that is not who we are. That is not our suchness. That is not our isness. Our suchness is divinity. Again, our suchness is luminosity and radiance, intelligence, wisdom, strength, fortitude, peace, love. And so part of the whole spiritual journey is to live out of that interior self, who we really are. Just think about this for a moment. You're looking at the screen or you're looking at something. There's a light that's emanating from deep within that allows your eyes to see and to process the light that's coming in. That's a manifestation of your radiant self. So we just have to remember that we are grace. And I'll close with this. This is how grace builds in our life. Again, grace is this energy. It is this intelligent consciousness that moves us in an evolutionary way. The more we listen to that grace, the more we move with that grace, the more that the grace intensifies, the more that the grace flows, the more that we become a stream of living grace, of living water. But we have to trust it. We have to go with it. We have to follow the inspirations and the intuitions. We have to be willing, in a sense, to live it and give it away. And when we do, Jesus said something very interesting. He said, the measure that you give, that you live from the grace and you share that grace, the measure that you give will come back to you, overflowing, pressed down and overflowing into your lap. So grace, again, is this river of energy that we learn to ride, that we learn to live, and it really propels us in our activity. The more we go with the flow of grace, the more grace flows from without into us and from within us, through us, and out of us. That's all that I have to say today on grace. And I would love to take some of your questions now. I think Ryan is going to read some of those questions to me.
Yes, thank you, Craig. There are a few questions that have been asked, and those of you who've been listening, if other questions come up, feel free to type them in the chat box. The first question is, what is the best way to open oneself up to grace?
Well, that's a good question. It's also a big question. I mentioned earlier today that we had this discipleship class. And one of the things that we talked about this morning was meditation. And one of the things I said to them about meditation is you do your kriyas, you do the kind of what I call the masculine part of the meditation practice. And then you don't force it. You don't force the experience of grace. You don't try to grab onto God, so to speak. You don't become graspy. It's really a process of allowing and letting go. And sometimes it's very uncomfortable to sit in meditation, for example, and to just be, to breathe, maybe to have a mantra, but to not force, to have that openness and letting go is very uncomfortable. But that's part of how I think grace emerges in our life, that we can just let go of how we think the meditation should be, how we think it should unfold, that we really let go and just trust that whatever is happening in the moment is grace. And that grace is unfolding just the way it needs to unfold. And then you can extend that beyond meditation. I just have this assumption, and I can't prove it in an empirical way, that wherever I am and whatever is happening to me in the moment, in some way, shape, or form, is an expression of grace. And whether or not that grace can flow through me and I can be receptive to it, all depends on how open I am, how willing I am to listen, how willing I am to express some grit. So what I like to say, and again, I could qualify this in a million ways, and I don't have the time to do that now, that part of my understanding of grace is that nothing happens to us, it all happens for us. And that helps to keep the heart open, because if we can keep the heart open, then grace flows. Growing up the way I did, I had a tendency to two things: to feel sorry for myself, number one, and number two, to get angry and to close my heart. And a lot of my spiritual journey has been not to feel sorry for myself, to trust divine providence, but to, in a very gentle way, to learn to keep my heart open so that grace can flow and wisdom can flow. And when I'm completely in over my head and I don't know what to do and I have no interior wisdom, I just go to this prayer: as you wish, thy will be done. As you wish, thy will be done. I can't hear you, Ryan.
Yeah, there we are. How about now?
Okay. Yeah, I can hear you.
The next question is, how can meditation help us recognize more grace?
Well, again, first of all, just the desire to meditate is a grace, okay? Bubbling up from your soul, it's a grace. Sitting in meditation, the discipline of sitting in meditation is a grace. It may or may not always feel pleasant at the moment. Again, don't reduce grace to pleasantness. But the desire to love God is loving God. The desire to meditate is a grace. Sitting down to meditate is a response to grace. So just recognizing that it's all grace can help us. And maybe I'll say it this way. Now, we are always in God. God is in us. God is the infinite ocean of beingness, and we are all waves in that ocean. So we're always in God, with God, inseparable from God, etc. But on a kind of live psychological level, one of the things that just helps me is, rather than me grasping for God and grace in meditation, to sit and let it come to me. just to sit. And sometimes it's hard just to let it come to me. There was that movie. I can't remember the name of it now. It was a famous movie 20 years ago. But anyways, in the movie, the metaphor is how to attract ladybugs. And you could go out with a net and try to chase them. You might get a few, or you could lay down in a field. And sooner or later, the ladybugs will come to you and crawl all over you. And I think in meditation, again, what I tell people is I love to do the Kriyas. Most mornings I will do 108 of the Kriya pranayamas. But for me, that's kind of the warm-up. And where the real meditation begins is being in that silence, being in that stillness, and waiting for the ladybugs to come and crawl on me, the ladybugs of grace. And again, the other thing that I said earlier is gratitude is very important. Gratitude awakens us to grace. You know, as I said earlier, today is a gift to me. I have another day to love my wife, to love my grandchildren, my children, to love life. It's a grace. So gratitude opens us to the experience of grace.
Well, that actually brings up one question from me, and then we'll get to the rest on the list here. You know, I've noticed that kind of gratitude tends to arise when people are going through difficult situations, you know, when maybe they're having health issues or you know, they're not certain of what's going to be happening in their life, you know, a few months from now, if they're even going to be around. So what I've kind of wondered and struggled with is, how do you explain to people without having to go through that? How can that be developed without having that kind of to be forced into it? You know, how did you come to it without being forced into it?
That's a great question, and I know this is going to border on sounding morbid, but every day I remind myself that death is certain. That there was going to come a moment when all of my life projects, as I understand them in this lifetime, are going to come to an end. A moment is going to come when I have to let go of everything: the Assisi Institute, my wife, my children, my grandchildren, as my relationship is presently constituted with them. So in this paradoxical way, it's reminding myself of my mortality. And then I take nothing for granted. I have 3 grandchildren that live in Nashville, and so I don't see them a lot. And as a psychotherapist working with people, I know that positive impact that grandparents can have on children well into adulthood. So every time I'm with them, and not in a frantic way, I just think, okay, there's a finite number of times I'm going to be with my grandchildren. And so I really want to love them. I really want to be present to them. I don't want to take a moment for granted. My wife and I are blessed. We have a great relationship. I tell her every day sincerely that I won the marriage lottery when I married her. And we have a backyard that has a beautiful view. Ryan, you'll see it when you come. And we often will sit in the morning and have a cup of coffee. And it's like every day I just say to her, I'm so grateful, because someday I'm not going to be sitting here with a cup of coffee with her. Now, I know that sounds morbid, but it really isn't. It's just, I think, embracing our mortality. It just makes us appreciate life more and more. And I tell people at the Assisi Institute, this moment is never going to come again. It's a unique manifestation of consciousness, of the cosmos, of the divine. So be present to it, celebrate it, really drink it in, because it's unique. And even in the context of reincarnation, I'm never going to be this me again. I'm never going to be Craig again. Never going to be Isha Das per se again. I'll carry, hopefully, my better traits with me and some of my worst ones, but I'm never going to be this me. So even to enjoy in a funny kind of, in a detached way, to enjoy this version of me that's never going to be here again. So, I think just having an awareness of our mortality, not in a morbid way, really just makes us more alive.
Yeah, very clear. Yeah. Another question: can grace come to you through another person, or in your experience, does it always come from source to you?
it all comes from source, and it comes from many, many different manifestations. So I'll go back to my time whenever I was in Roy's presence, I felt grace. I felt something uplifting. When I was just at his center, the vibrations there are always uplifting. Yeah, so grace comes to us in a myriad of ways. Something that Yogananda said that I think about often is environment trumps willpower. So putting ourselves in situations and places where we know people are moving in the right direction or trying to move in the right direction, it makes all the difference in the world. So yeah, grace comes to us through people, through nature, through food, through everything. And we learn to be more and more open to all of it. Sitting there, with my wife sharing a cup of coffee is like, let me share a little bit of my background. I grew up Catholic, and, the Eucharist, the Catholic Mass was always very important to me, so on and so forth. But when I sit there and have a cup of coffee with my wife in the morning, I will sometimes say we're having a cup of divinity together. And it's just as divine as the Mass, and when we have eyes to see.
And another question, this is definitely one that comes up often. Would you explain a bit more about how to go through a difficult situation with grace? And, my addition to this is I think many people in the yoga community have the idea that if you're in a difficult situation, the way you go through it with grace is by always smiling and acting like it's just a wonderful thing or something like that. So anyway, back to the question, would you explain a bit more about how to go through a difficult situation with grace?
Yeah. Number one, having a routine in place, a meditation routine, an exercise routine, just some kind of gentle discipline in your life. It becomes a container. It doesn't fix everything, don't misunderstand me, but it becomes a container that holds us in a difficult time or period. So I think having a disciplined, a spiritual discipline, healthy practices, and to continue them when we're going through a difficult time is a piece of it. A second thing, I like what you said, Ryan, that we think that, that if you're kind of enlightened or self-realized that you never shed a tear, there's actually a tradition, it's a strong one with the Catholic saints, but it's called the gift of tears. And just giving yourself a permission to have a good cry and to express your pain. Now, there's a way that you can express it where you victimize yourself, or you can just say, it hurts. I'm hurting now. And you can say that to God. You can say that to yourself. You can say that to the image of the guru. And you can certainly say that to other people. But to give yourself permission to have a good cry, to give yourself permission to go through a period of grieving, and to just know that at some level that too is grace. So, and again, I think the other thing is to have some people in your life. Again, I'm just very blessed to have a wonderful wife that, I still have pain. I still suffer. I think there is this misnomer that if we're enlightened enough, we graduate from the human condition and there's no more displeasure or pain. I don't think that's the case. So for me, being able to share that with my wife, sometimes you can share it with a counselor, sometimes you can share it with a spiritual mentor, a best friend. But yeah, you can't just fake your way through it. And there's something about tears, not to romanticize pain, but there's something about tears that soften the heart and open the heart and allow grace to flow. So again, I think in a very practical level, whether it's one person or a community of people, to have a loving group of people around you. I'm half Italian. My wife is full-blooded Italian. She comes from a big Italian family. And my father-in-law, who was a wonderful man, he died 3 years ago this July. He lived with us. Was just a real Renaissance man, one of my heroes. And every year, and he was such a good grandfather and incredible. and father. And every year around the anniversary of his death, we have a luncheon together, or we go out for breakfast and we reminisce, and we get sad and we reminisce, tell funny stories about him, and we cry a little bit and tell funny stories about him. One of the stories, I'm really digressing, but one of the stories, I'm sitting there once, and his name was Salvatore, and he turned to me and he said, "I know you're half Italian, but you look like a mongrel." And I said, "Salvatore." And he said, "What? I'm just telling you the truth." So we tell these stories and we laugh and we cry. So a sense of community and humor, I think, is part of what gets us through it.
Yeah, I remember when Melissa was passing, there was a pizza place at the bottom of the hill of our condo development, and I loved that pizza. And I can remember one point in time, I was eating a piece of pizza and I was crying, and I said, "At least I still have pizza."
Well, and you know what? Let me use the Catholic language. In that context, pizza becomes a sacrament. It becomes manna.
That's right. That's right. And before I forget, there's another question here which we'll get to, but we're going to have a discussion about pasta and pasta sauce sometime in the future. So just be ready for that. Okay.
All right.
So another question. You mentioned grace will do whatever it takes to evolve us. What does it practically mean to allow grace to flow? What does grace flowing look like or act like in a situation?
Wow, these are great questions, keeping me on my toes. Let me just keep it this could lead into a whole nother explanation that I don't want to get into, but this is just my approach. Whatever is happening to me at the moment is grace. Whether I understand it or not, whether it feels good or not, it's grace. Therefore, I stop fighting it. See, the more we fight the isness of what, and I'm not talking about becoming passive and just giving in to things, but the more we resist the isness of what is, the suchness of what is, then we actually step away from grace and we constrict. So for me, just a radical level of acceptance to the isness of the moment, being curious about it. What's the lesson? What can I do? What can I avoid? But radically accepting whatever we're experiencing in the moment without necessarily indulging it is how I think everything then becomes a grace.
One question that comes up for me when you're talking about that, a lot of people whom get involved in yoga and a lot of students that I have, they're very type A types of people, and they want to do a good job, and they want to get their life in order, and they want to feel peace, and they want this sense of clarity, and they want this sense of grace. And oftentimes it's like, you tell them, all right, well, if you do your meditation, do your pranayama, they're like, great, I will do that every day, and I will do all of this pranayama, and I will read these books. But then they write back and say, yeah, but I still don't have that sense of I'm doing all this stuff, but it feels like I'm forcing it. So I'm just kind of curious, in your experience, how you might relate to people to get them to be present, yet not necessarily too passive, but also how do you encourage them to just kind of chill out every now and then?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So let me just say that grace and spiritual energy it's natural. It is natural. We live and we breathe in a sea of grace, as I said before. And I'm I don't always look like a type A, but I'm a type A, I'm going to storm the heavens and et cetera, et cetera. And there's some value to that. But it's, again, just allowing and recognizing that this little egoic mind is not in control of anything really. And so that grace is natural. Forcing it is unnatural. Now, this is the key thing. What you said is that doesn't mean passivity. That doesn't mean falling asleep. It doesn't mean a vegetative kind of consciousness. It is staying awake and aware. And it's not always comfortable staying awake and aware, because you're going to feel that tension inside. You're going to feel that graspiness. If you can just stay present, breathe. Sometimes I feel it in my chest area. And I will sometimes just gently breathe right into it, like that. Let's just dive into it and not resist it. And I'll use a mantra, often just Om, just to keep it simple and not complicate my mind. Om, Om, as I breathe into it. And if I have the courage to handle the discomfort, sooner or later, something breaks. And I'll tell you a funny story. This is 2 weeks ago. I was during one of my meditations. Again, I could feel my insides grinding. And sometimes mantras come to me, but they're very untraditional mantras, but they always seem to work in that moment. So the mantra that came to me was, I give up. So I just kept on saying, not giving up in a nihilistic way, but just, I give up. I just give up. And I kept on saying it. And it was just like the magic was within 10 minutes, all of a sudden my heart opened and I was there. Now, the next day, my egoic mind said, oh, now you got the perfect mantra. So I sat down and I said, I give up, and it didn't work. So you got to be open to grace and the fluidity and these inspirations. And more in my meditation, the meditative part, sometimes these phrases will just come to me and I go with them and I find that they work.
Yeah. That's a good point when you mentioned the idea of having the mantra come and it worked that day, but it didn't work the next day. And I think that's an important point that a lot of people miss, that it's you have to be responsive and fluid within that moment. And you mentioned a lot about your wife, and I've noticed that in relationships too. You can't just keep doing the same thing every day and think you need to show your love a little bit differently, maybe every now and then. You just can't keep pushing the same button.
Yes. Yes.
So, you know what I mean.
Yeah, I'll tell you a funny story. Vicki and I, we've been married 11 years, and we were best friends forever and ever. But I had lived a single life for a long time, from the time I was 31 until 55 or 54. And so we were married a few weeks, and when I was time to go to bed, I would just get up and go to bed. And one day she said to me, we have to have a rule. And I said, what's that? You come over, you kiss me goodnight, and you tell me you love me, and you tell me you're going to bed. I said, I can do that. So you have to listen, because every day is going to be a little bit different.
Yes. That was. I had a similar issue in that for some reason I would always say, like, I'll see you later. Like, for some reason that was my way of saying good night.
Yes.
And it drove Melissa crazy until finally she was always aggravated, and she finally said to me, "Look, you can't just say I'll see you later."
Yeah.
So anyway, but we do have some more questions here, so I'll get back to those.
Okay.
So this one I'm going to do my best with. I'll read it slowly so it makes sense to me as well as everyone else. Richard Rohr's Falling Upward was a game changer for me. Regret and self-judgment, stuck in that. He said a lot about falling. We came to fall and get up. Those who have gone down can understand up and go up and not misuse it. That twist on defining grace gave me such hope, help, and forgiveness. Can you expound just a bit on that?
Yes. And I'll again use an example. I'm not a recovering alcoholic, but in my early days, I was an alcoholism counselor, and I used to take people to AA meetings. And I was always fascinated with AA because I love it. It's a kind of non-religious spirituality. But I would hear people say at an AA meeting, I'm a grateful recovering alcoholic. And that always sounded like an oxymoron. Like, how can you put those two words together? And so I remember approaching this man who said that he was a grateful recovering alcoholic. And what he said was kind of what Richard was saying in that book, Falling Upward, is I hit rock bottom. I lost everything. But that was the beginning of moving upwards. That was the beginning of surrendering to God and giving my life over to God. And so therefore, he said, I'm a grateful recovering alcoholic. I think that there's a moment in the spiritual life where, and particularly if you're a type A personality, where you do your best, you work hard, you do your best. But at some point, what I tell people, the metaphor that works for me is that all the meditation practices and techniques, they get us to the gate of the temple, which is a wonderful place to be. But only grace gets us into the temple, i.e., unitive consciousness. And sometimes it's our imperfections and our failings that we surrender and we give up. All of a sudden places us in the temple. So, and I do think that ultimately, even Yogananda, if you go to the autobiography of a yogi, he was meditating and meditating. Sri Yukteswar was calling him and he said, something like, "You're disturbing me, I'm meditating." And Sri Yukteswar said something like, "Well, you're not doing a very good job. Your mind is wandering. Come on out." And Yogananda came, and I don't remember the exact words, but then Sri Yukteswar just touched his chest, and all of a sudden he had this experience of cosmic consciousness. Roy talks about being touched by Saint Lin and going into some level of samadhi. So we reach a point where we realize our efforts only take us so far, and that often will feel like a bottom. But then that bottom brings us up. And in my own life, it is the awareness, and this is the paradox. I'll say it this way. Whatever spiritual power I have, it comes through my powerlessness. There's an understanding at the egoic level that there's really nothing I can do. In fact, I'll mess it up at that level. And when and I have that humility, and when I'm aware of that powerlessness opens me up to grace. And I'll tell a Richard Rohr story because he's a type A. He's a 1 on the Enneagram, if anybody's familiar with the 9 personality types. And Richard told me this, that when he was in the seminary studying to be a Franciscan priest, he tried to be the perfect seminarian. He tried to please everybody. He tried to do everything perfectly. And finally, he just said one day he realized it wasn't working and he was miserable and he just gave up. And that's one of the turning points, he said, in his own spiritual evolution, was when he just gave up.
Yes, there's much could be said about that.
Yes.
Well, we'll keep going though. So there's another question here, and this may be the final question unless another one pops up before we finish. The question is, everything is grace, but there is also electricity. Is it because of the egocentric intention behind electricity? ?
Yes. Electricity is the result of the ego trying to manipulate and control grace. Okay? Electricity is the egoic mind, the egoic will trying to manipulate grace. It was easy to answer. It was simple.
Good. Well, that'll take us to the end of our question and answer session. Is there anything else you'd like to add today?
No, just again that it's been wonderful being with all of you. And Ryan, I really want to honor you for doing this. I hope we can all do more and more of this, come together this way. Again, I do think we're not going back to the pre-COVID normal. I really do think on so many levels, but particularly in the terms of spirituality and Kriya, it's a new normal that is coming into focus, and we really do need each other. So I just want to thank you for that, and just personally just say how much we're looking forward to you coming here in September. We'll have some fun.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to it, and also some pasta.
Yes.
But one of the things I've noticed this weekend that we've been doing this retreat, you and I, we've obviously gone to retreats. We've been at CSA. We've led retreats. I know many people here have done so as well. But one of the things I appreciated, I mentioned it this morning, was that even though we're scattered across the world, really, and we've got people from all over the world, my days while participating in this retreat, I have noticed how much clearer just my daily experiences by participating in this together. We have the morning meditations, then the sessions like this, and I was going for a bike ride yesterday, and usually I just kind of put in my earbuds and listen to some music, and for some reason I did not find myself planning. I did not find myself overthinking about things, trying to see how to improve this process or this retreat or anything. There was just a state of being right there, and this idea of satsang and coming together in truth, I think that it's wonderful to see that it can be supported in this way with this kind of field of people all over the world, and doesn't always have to be traveling to faraway places. So
no, my first experience of that was right when COVID really kicked in, and Ellen O'Brien, Uma, out in California in San Jose, she had a kind of something like what you're doing. She had it wasn't as long, but a meditation, and she gave a talk, and she had Swami Nirvanananda doing chanting, and she really wanted me to participate in it, and I kind of inwardly in a begrudging kind of way said okay, but it was my first experience with Zoom, and I thought, and when we meditated together, there it was. I was just shocked at how it was there. And we didn't have to physically be in each other's presence. So I'm just echoing what you're saying. And we've done a lot of retreats at the Assisi Institute through COVID via Zoom. Done them all through Zoom, and people say the same thing, that it's virtually like being there.
Yeah. Well, there's no separation in time and space in this.
Yeah, there isn't.
So, all right. Well, anyway, thank you so much for being here. Much appreciated. And I'm sure we'll do some more videos and podcasts and work together in the future. And we'll keep these kinds of ideas going.
I really see you as a spiritual brother, and I just really appreciate your ministry. And I think you're a man of profound wisdom. So I'm always blessed to be in your presence. Thank you.
No problem. I guess I played my role okay then. So,
yeah, you do pretty good.
Yeah, you too.
We'll see you later. God bless everybody.
Yes, take care. Take care, everyone. See you all at 6 for meditation.